Please, just a sandwich. Anything." The weak and trembling voice made David Carter freeze in the back seat of his limo. That voice could not be. Through the dark window of the vehicle, he saw a lean, poorly dressed woman begging outside a downtown Chicago diner. The dirty blonde hair was stuck with a cheap elastic. The clothes seemed not to be washed for days, and she had a cup of plastic with some coins. The passers-by passed her as if it were invisible, some even changing sidewalks to avoid meeting. It was Sarah, his wife Sarah. David Carter, CEO of one of the largest builders in the United States, had just returned from 3 weeks in Dubai closing Millionaire contracts. His company, Carter Construction Group, was expanding to the Middle East with projects that totaled over $200 million. During his absence, he had completely entrusted to the administration of the family mansion to Richard Wells, his right arm, for 8 years. Richard was not an ordinary employee. Graduated in Harvard Business School, a former Goldman Sachs executive, had become much more than a personal assistant, was practically a family member. David trusted him with bank passwords, confidential contracts, even with the keys of the personal safe. Richard Wells was the only person in the world in whom David placed absolute confidence, especially to take care of Sarah during his frequent business trips. "Stop the car, now," David ordered the driver, his voice coming out lower and controlled than he expected. But inside, a storm was beginning to form. "And call the police if I don't leave in 10 minutes. How had Sarah had come there? Why was it on the streets asking for food when it had left more than $50,000 in the joint account specifically for her personal expenses during her absence? In addition, he had instructed Richard to ensure that Sarah had access to all corporate cards and that any need for her be treated as an absolute priority. David also remembered having left specific instructions for Richard to reserve additional funds so that Sarah could be distracted during her absence. Days spa, dinners with friends, shopping at her favorite mall. Sarah was always melancholy when he traveled, and David made a point of compensating for his absence with financial generosity. While watching his wife of 15 years of marriage being ignored by passers-by, David remembered small details that he had chosen to ignore in the last calls. Sarah's always tired voice, as if she were permanently exhausted. The constant excuses not to make video llamadas. "I have a headache. The light is bad here. I need to rest." The conversations cut quickly when she said Richard was coming to discuss home issues. Strange even more. In the last 2 weeks, Richard had assumed all communications with Sarah. "She's fine, Mr. Carter. Just a little unwell," he always said that David asked her. "I thought it better to let her rest and not bother her with calls during her important business." At the time, David had interpreted this as professional zeal. Now, each word sounded like a carefully built lie. There were other disturbing signs that David could now connect. When she called home on the landline, Richard always answered immediately, as if waiting next to the device. "Sarah is in the bath," or "Sarah went out for a walk," were the default answers. Why did your wife, who always loved to talk to him during the trips, was always unavailable? David also remembered something that disturbed him in the last conversation with Richard 3 days ago. When he asked about household expenses, Richard had responded with a strangely defensive tone. "All under control, sir. Sarah has been very economical in her choices. It almost spends anything." For a man who knew Sarah 15 years ago, that should have sounded alarms immediately. Sarah was never economical. She loved spas, expensive restaurants, shopping with her friends. Worse still, Richard had casually mentioned that Sarah was on a strict diet, and that he had hired a special nutritionist to accompany her. "She wants to be perfect for when the Lord returns," he had said with that smile and the tone of voice that David always interpreted as genuine care. Sarah looked up as David approached, and what he saw destroyed him inside. Those blue eyes that once shone with love were now back, haunted, like those of someone who had completely lost hope. There was something more disturbing. She seemed physically smaller, as if he had shrunk. She looked at him for a moment without recognizing, as if he were just there, a stranger who could or could not have mercy on her. The shock of seeing Sarah in that state was amplified when David noted that she was shaking uncontrollably, even with the mild temperature of Chicago afternoon. His lips were cracked, a clear sign of prolonged dehydration, and there were deep dark circles under his eyes that suggested sleepless nights. "Sarah," David whispered, kneeling beside her on the dirty sidewalk. It was then that he noticed other horrible details. Her hands had small cuts, as if she had moved something dangerous. There was a strange mark on his wrist, as if something had been tied there recently. And the smell? It was not just a shortage of bath, there was a strong medicinal odor, as if it had been forced to take some kind of medication. It was only when she heard her voice that the realization hit her as a lightning. Sarah began to tremble uncontrollably, the tears gushing as if a dam had broken. But along with relief there was something that seemed pure terror. as if she was afraid that someone would see her talking to David. David? Did you come back? She touched his face with dirty and trembling hands as if he couldn't believe he was real. I thought, Richard said he showed messages, official documents. What messages, Sarah? What documents? What did Richard said? David's voice was dangerously calm, but his fists closed instinctively. Sarah looked around with panic, as if expecting someone to be watching her. He said you didn't want to see me anymore, that I had become a weight for your international business, that you had left orders for me, so that I was... She stopped, swallowing dry. He said you wanted the divorce, but I didn't want to give me anything because I didn't deserve it. Sarah, I never... David started, but she kept talking, the words coming out in torrents as if she had saved it for weeks. He changed the passwords of the cards. He said they were orders from his direct Dubai. Then he changed the home locks. He said the mansion was no longer my house, that you had decided that I should learn to support me alone before receiving any penny from the divorce agreement. Sarah sobbed now. I tried to call you dozens of times, but he said you had blocked me in all numbers, which I never wanted to talk to me again. David felt anger growing inside him like an uncontrolled fire. Richard had not only been isolated Sarah financially, she had isolated her emotionally, making her believe that her own husband had abandoned her cruelly and definitively. Each tear on Sarah's face was a personal affront that required meticulous and devastating revenge. Sarah, I never said any of these things. I love you. I always loved you. David hugged his wife, feeling how physically fragile she was, not just lean but really weakened. Richard lied to you. He lied to me. He separated us on purpose for some reason I still don't understand. Sarah began to cry harder, but now they were tears of relief mixed with deep confusion. But the documents, he showed me papers with his signature. Divorce papers, David. His signature was there. At that moment, sitting on Chicago's icy sidewalk with his nunned wife in his arms, David Carter made a decision that would change his life forever. Whoever had done that with Sarah would pay in a way he could never imagine. David had not built a $200 million empire being passive with whom he betrayed him, and Richard Wells had made the fatal error of completely underestimating the man who was trying to destroy. But what David didn't know yet was that the betrayal was much deeper than he could dream, and that Richard Wells had completely underestimated the man who was trying to destroy. Most importantly, the person who would reveal the whole truth would be someone David barely noticed in his own home, someone who had witnessed every moment of cruelty in silence, waiting for the right day to speak. Manuel Delgado, the discreet Philippine who worked as a gardener of the mansion 4 years ago, had seen and heard things that would make David rethink everything he believed to know about loyalty, greed, and the true nature of the people in whom we trust our lives. And what Manuel knew about Richard Wells's true plans would make David's blood boil in a way he never experienced before. There, holding Sarah in her arms on Chicago's dirty sidewalk, David had no idea that she was about to discover such an elaborate and cruel conspiracy, that she would forever change her vision about betrayal, revenge, and the true price of blind confidence. If you have already felt betrayed by someone whom you blindly trusted, then you know that revenge. It is to be served with intelligence, not angry. Subscribe to the channel to find out how David turned her pain into a lesson Richard Wells would never forget. David took Sarah straight to the Four Seasons Hotel, refusing to return home until he completely understood what Richard had done. In the luxurious room, while Sarah took her first hot bath in weeks, David began making calls that would reveal the devastating extension of betrayal. Mr. Carter? The surprised voice of Janet, manager of the private bank, echoed over the phone. I thought the Lord was aware of the transfers. Mr. Wells presented documents with his signature authorizing the movement of $400,000 of IMS's, Carter's personal account. David's blood froze. Janet, I never authorized any transfer. Richard has no power of attorney to move my wife's personal accounts. Sir, I have the documents here. Your signature is perfectly recognized by our graphology specialists. And there is more. Mr. Wells requested the blockade of all Mrs. Carter cards for suspicion of unauthorized use by third parties. David hung up with his hands shaking with anger. Richard had not only been isolated Sarah emotionally, he had financially sabotaged in a meticulous and calculated manner, using such sophisticated falsifications that they even deceived banking experts. The phone rang. It was Richard, with that controlled and professional voice David has known for 8 years. Mr. Carter, how good to know that it has come well. I hope the business in Dubai have been running as planned. Richard, where is my wife? David kept his voice calm, determined not to show his letters yet. Sarah? Oh yes, she left early today. He said she was going to do some shopping at the mall. You know how excited she gets when you come back. The naturalness of the lie was impressive. Richard lied as he breathed, without hesitation or embarrassment. Richard, I need to see her immediately. Where exactly she is? There was a long pause. Calculated. Sir, I need to be honest with you. Sarah has been presenting some, worrying behaviors during his absence. Excessive expenses, frequent night exits, even foreign conversations on the phone. I thought it better not to bother you with these details while closing important business. David wanted to strangle Richard over the phone. Each word was a lie carefully built to plant seeds of distrust about Sarah. What kind of strange conversations? Well, sir, she has talked a lot about starting a new life and break free from old commitments. Yesterday I heard her saying on the phone that she was tired of living this scam. Richard paused dramatically. Mr. Carter, as his friend for 8 years, I need to suggest that it may be time to consider a friendly separation before the situation is further complicated. The manipulation was so elaborate that David was momentarily speechless. Richard had spent weeks planting false evidence, creating a narrative where Sarah was the unfaithful villain, and he was the loyal counselor trying to protect David from an opportunistic wife. Richard, I want you out of my house until tomorrow morning, David finally said. Mr. Carter, I understand that he is upset, but he needs to understand that everything I did was to protect him. Sarah is no longer the woman with whom she married. Money and status changed her. Richard's voice gained an almost paternal tone. Dismiss me now would be a mistake that would cost much more than you think. The veiled threat made David realize that Richard had prepared for this moment. How many business secrets did he know? How many confidential contracts had you accessed? Richard was not just a traitor. He was a strategic traitor who had positioned himself as indispensable exactly for this kind of confrontation. When Sarah got out of the bath, David saw the actual extent of the damage. In addition to the obvious malnutrition, there were marks on their arms that seemed like physical containment. Sarah explained in a trembling voice, as Richard had progressively isolated from her entire support network. He told my friends that I was undergoing psychiatric treatment and could not receive visits. It changed my phone number saying it was for your digital security. When I tried to leave home, you said you had hired security guards to prevent me from doing public scandals. David found that Richard had created such an elaborate psychological prison system that Sarah genuinely believed he was being protected from his own madness. Controlled medications were regularly administered in medical order, keeping it in a state of constant confusion. David, I started believing that I was really going crazy, Sarah cried in her husband's arms. He showed videos of mine saying things that I didn't remember saying, conversations that I had supposedly had, but they made no sense in my memory. Edited recordings. Richard had used deepfake technology to create false evidence of Sarah's erratic behavior, not only to convince her of her own instability, but also as ammunition if David questioned her decisions. What most disturbed David was realizing that Richard had meticulously studied their psychology before executing his plan. He knew David sank at work when he was emotionally shaken. He knew that Sarah had undergone depression after her mother's death and would be vulnerable to gaslighting about her mental health. Each blow was precisely calculated to achieve its greatest weaknesses. Even more shocking, David found that Richard had documented everything. Sarah photos in deplorable states, recordings of her panic seizures, even videos of her begging to talk to David. Not for sadism, but as life insurance if confronted, evidence he could use to prove that he was trying to help a woman with serious mental problems. That night, while Sarah finally slept in peace for the first time, David received a message from Richard, who revealed the true extension of her sociopathy. Mr. Carter, I'm sorry that I discovered Sarah this way. I tried to save him, but now we need to talk about how to solve this business reputation. I have extensive medical documentation about her mental state. We see tomorrow at 9 a.m. to discuss a soft transition. Bribery. Richard was threatening to destroy not only Sarah, but the entire David business empire if he didn't cooperate. It was the final play of a man who had spent 8 years preparing for this moment of total confrontation. David looked at his sleeping wife and made a decision that would change his life forever. Richard Wells had chosen the wrong person to blackmail. What Harvard's well-educated sociopath did not know was that David Carter had built a $200 million empire not being passive, with whom he tried to destroy him. But Richard didn't know about Manuel Delgado either, the discreet Filipino gardener he had seen and recorded things that would turn the blackmail game into something completely different. Things that would make Richard realize that he had underestimated not only David, but the whole network of royal loyalty that existed around the Carter family. While typing an answer to Richard, "We see ourselves at 9 a.m. I have some surprises for you too," David could not imagine that in the next 12 hours he would find that Richard's betrayal was far beyond what his mind could sue, and that the revenge he planned would only be the beginning of a revelation that would shake the foundations of everything he believed about confidence, loyalty, and the true price of success. David woke up at 5 a.m. with a crystalline plane in his mind. While Sarah still slept deeply for the first time in months, He began making calls to people Richard Wells didn't even imagine that they existed in his life. The first was for Marcus Thompson, a private investigator specializing in corporate crimes. "Marcus, I need everything about Richard Wells. And when I say everything, I include from his coffee shopping to whom he talks to when he thinks no one is seeing." David spoke low, but his voice carried a determination that Marcus recognized immediately. It was the tone of a man who had made an irrevocable decision. The second connection was even more strategic. David called Manuel Delgado, the Filipino gardener who took care of the mansion gardens 4 years ago. A discreet man who everyone underestimated, but David knew how to graduate in electronic engineering in Manila before immigrating to the United States. "Mr. David, thank God the Lord called." Manuel's voice trembled with relief. "I tried to protect Mrs. Sarah, but Mr. Richard said the Lord had commanded me not to interfere with the affairs of the house." David felt a twinge of guilt. Manuel had tried to help Sarah and was silenced by Richard using his own authority as a weapon. "Manuel, I need you to tell me everything, absolutely everything you saw Richard do to my wife." What Manuel revealed in the next 20 minutes made David's blood boil in a way he had never experienced. Richard had not only mistreated Sarah, had created a system of elaborate psychological torture, filming everything for his own sadistic entertainment. He had cameras hidden throughout the house, Mr. David, not only for security, but to record Mrs. Sarah at his most vulnerable moments. He showed the videos to friends during dinners, laughing at her sufferings like a comic movie. Worse yet, Manuel revealed that Richard had been hired not by case, but as part of a larger scheme. "He has done this to other rich families, sir. I heard telephone conversations where he talked about previous customers and how he had optimized the value extraction process." David found that Richard had transformed the destruction of families into a lucrative and systematic business. Sarah wasn't an isolated victim. She was just another project in Richard Wells in the sadistic career. "Manuel, did you manage to keep evidence of something?" David asked, although he already knew about wisdom in the tone of voice of Filipino, that the answer would be exactly what he needed to hear. "Mr. David, I'm an electronic engineer. When I saw what Mr. Richard was doing, I started recording everything too. I have more than 40 hours of video of him mistreating Mrs. Sarah, as well as telephone conversations where he admits having done this with other families." Manuel took a significant break. He never noticed that the ignorant gardener had installed recording devices throughout the house. The irony was delicious. Richard, in his class arrogance, had completely underestimated Manuel, assuming that a Philippine immigrant working as a gardener would be unable to understand or interfere with his sophisticated schemes. This arrogance would be your ruin. At 9 a.m., David arrived at the mansion for the meeting with Richard, but not alone. Marcus Thompson was discreetly parked on the street with professional recording equipment, and Manuel was waiting in the garden with a laptop containing enough evidence to destroy Richard in every way imaginable. Richard was in the office, sitting comfortably in David's chair, drinking expensive coffee and flipping through the company's confidential documents. The casual arrogance with which David's ownership was dealt with as his own revealed how deeply he had convinced himself of his own unbeatery. "David, glad you decided to be reasonable." Richard didn't even get up from his chair, a deliberate insult that demonstrated how confident in his position of power was. "I brought the mansion transfer documents. I think it would be better to start a new life elsewhere, don't you agree?" David sat calmly in the opposite armchair, observing Richard with a serenity that the sociopath interpreted as resignation. "Richard, before we sign anything, I have some questions about household expenses during my absence." Of course, Richard responded with nauseating condescension. Sarah was very spent, unfortunately. Dear spas, restaurants, even some addictions I discovered. Drugs, David. His wife developed a serious drug problem during his absence. The lie was so elaborate that David almost admired Richard's sadistic creativity. He had prepared a complete narrative to justify Sarah's deplorable state, turning the victim to guilty and positioning himself as the hero who tried to save a condemned marriage. "In fact, I have medical documentation proving her addiction. It would be terrible if it leaked to your international investors, don't you think?" Richard smiled with the confidence of those who believe he has all the cards in his hand. "I would say that a generous separation agreement would be much cheaper than a public scandal." David nodded thoughtfully as if considering the blackmail. Richard interpreted the silence as Victoria, not realizing that he was being recorded by professional equipment and that each word was being documented for later use. "You know, Richard, you're right. A public scandal would be terrible for everyone involved." David stood up, walking to the window that gave to the garden where Manuel waited discreetly. "That's why I decided to avoid scandals and deal with it more directly." It was then that Richard noticed something that made him frown. David did not seem like a defeated man accepting blackmail. There was a calm in his eyes that was much more disturbing than any anger or despair. It was the calm of someone who knows exactly what will happen in the coming minutes. "David, did you sign the papers or not?" Richard tried to keep his tone authoritarian, but something in David's posture made him feel a first shiver of uncertainty. David smiled for the first time since the beginning of the conversation. It was not a smile of resignation or friendship. It was the smile of someone who was about to reveal letters that Richard didn't even know existed in the deck. "Richard, you spent 8 years working with me but apparently never learned the most important business lesson." David came back, but now his posture had changed completely. Never underestimate someone who has more to lose than you. And never, never stir with the family of a man who built an empire of $200 million, not being passive with whom he tries to destroy him. Ree's confident smile, Chard began to falter. For the first time in 8 years, he was seeing David Carter not as the confident boss he could manipulate, but as the relentless entrepreneur who had crushed far more powerful competitors than a simple sociopath with Harvard diploma. At that moment, Richard Wells began to realize that he might have made the most expensive mistake of his criminal life. But I still had no idea that in the next 10 minutes I would find that underestimating David Carter would only be the first in a series of fatal errors that would destroy not only his plans, but all his existence as he knew. David got up and walked to the office door. "Manuel, can you come in, please?" Richard frowned when he saw the Philippine gardener enter discreetly, carrying a laptop. "David, what is this? We don't have time for gardening issues now." "Richard, I want to introduce you to the electronic engineer Manuel Delgado, graduated from the University of Manila, specialist in digital surveillance systems." David smiled, watching the color disappear from Richard's face. "Oh, you didn't know? You thought it was just the ignorant gardener, didn't you?" Manuel opened the laptop calmly and turned the screen to Richard. The video clearly showed Richard forcing Sarah to take controlled medications as she begged to talk to David. The quality of the image was crystal clear, the perfectly clear audio. "This is not cool, you can't record me without permission," Richard shouted, raising suddenly from his chair. "Actually, I can," David replied serenely. "This is my private property, and I explicitly authorized Manuel to install security systems throughout the house after a few incidents you reported on Sarah. You remember, right? When you said she was having strange behaviors and it would be prudent to monitor her." The irony was delicious. Richard had used his own lie about Sarah's erratic behavior to justify the installation of the system that now condemned him. Manuel advanced to the next video. Richard appeared on the phone, laughing while showing pictures of Sarah malnourished to an unidentified woman. "Look how thin it was. The previous customer didn't last 2 months, but this one is holding 3. Easy money, honey. Hold it down." Richard advanced toward the laptop, but David held him firmly by the arm. "We haven't finished yet, Richard. Manuel, can you show the telephone conversation last Thursday?" The audio that left the speakers made Richard completely collapse in the chair. It was his own voice, clear as crystal. "David Carter is a sentimental idiot. After I finish destroying his wife, I'm going to clean the company's bank accounts and disappear. I've done it with 4 families before him. Rich traumatized is the easiest target." Richard was now visibly trembling, sweating cold, realizing that each incriminating word had been captured and documented. "David, you don't understand. I can explain." "You can explain to the FBI, Richard." David showed the phone. "Marcus, can you come in now?" Marcus Thompson entered accompanied by 2 federal agents. "Richard Wells, you are arrested for bank fraud, kidnapping, extortion, document forgery, and gang formation for crimes against high-income families." Richard's arrogance evaporated instantly. "No, this can't be happening. David, we can make a deal. I return everything. Everything." "Richard, you spent $4,000 of my wife's account in 3 weeks. Where is this money?" David crossed his arms, watching Richard squirm. I invested. It was an investment for her future." Manuel showed another screen in the laptop. Bank extracts showed transfers to accounts in tax havens, expensive jewelry purchases, luxury cars, even a home in France that Richard had bought on behalf of a ghost company. "Marcus's investigation revealed fascinating things about you, Richard. Your true identity is Robert Wells, a fugitive from justice in 3 states for similar crimes. Harvard Business School, never studied there. Goldman Sachs, never worked there. Even your refined accent is forgery." Richard, or Robert, started to cry. They were not tears of repentance, but of pure despair in realizing that his carefully built life was crumbling in real time. "Worst of all, Richard, is that you documented your own cruelties. Manuel found more than 50 videos you recorded psychologically torturing my wife. You sent them to other criminals as educational material. FBI has already identified your entire network." One of the Richard handcuff agents, who now sobbed uncontrollably. "Please, David, I have information about other cases. I can help. "You are going help, Richard, in the federal prison, where he will spend the next 20 years of his life." David approached the man who had tried to destroy his family. "But before I go, I want you to know something." David pulled the phone and showed a notification. As we talked here, Marcus was sending all the videos of his cruelty to each person on his contact list. Your high society friends, the customers you impressed with stories about managing difficult families, all received a sample of the monster you really are. Richard looked at the phone and saw dozens of messages coming. People distancing themselves, contracts being canceled, their reputation being destroyed in real time on social networks. "Oh, and Richard, remember those impeccable references you presented when I hired you?" Marcus found out that they were all paid. Actors hired to pretend to be old employers. Even their previous victims never had the courage to report you because you convinced them that they were crazy. While Richard was taken handcuffed by the agents, David felt a deep satisfaction, but also a strange void. Revenge was complete, but the emotional price had been very high for everyone involved. Manuel closed the laptop discreetly. "Mr. David, Mrs. Sarah is safe at the hotel." "Yes, Manuel, and you? Are you well after witnessing all these cruelty and silence?" Filipino nodded with dignity. "I grew up in the Philippines for very difficult times, sir. I learned that sometimes the only way to protect innocence is to document the crimes of the powerful and wait for the right time to act." David looked out the window and saw Richard being placed in the federal police car. The man who had tried to systematically destroy his family now faced decades in prison, his reputation forever ruined, his FBI frozen bank accounts. But as he observed Richard Wells's definitive fall, David could not imagine that this victory would only be the beginning of a much greater transformation in his life, a transformation that would completely rethink his priorities, his relationships, and the true definition of success. Sarah was waiting for him at the hotel, finally free from the nightmare she had lived. But could they rebuild a marriage that had been so brutally attacked? And would David learn the most important lesson of all, about not letting work consume her personal life? 6 months later, David Carter was sitting in his renewed office, watching the gardens Manuel had turned into something even more beautiful than before. The house, which had already been a successful symbol, now represented something much deeper, the family's victory over who tried to destroy it. Sarah came in with 2 cups of coffee, a morning ritual who had recovered after months of couple therapy. She was unrecognizable. She had not only recovered the lost weight, but she shone with a confidence that David had not seen for years. The traumatic experience, as painful as it had been, had revealed an inner force that she didn't even know how to possess. "The lawyer called," Sarah said, sitting in the armchair next to the table. Richard was sentenced to 25 years in federal imprisonment. No possibility of parole for the first 12 years. David nodded, feeling a silent satisfaction. Richard Wells, or Robert Wells, as they found to be his real name, had been completely unmasked. The FBI investigation revealed that he had systematically destroyed 17 families for 15 years, stealing more than $3 million, and leaving a trail of shattered lives. The most satisfactory had been to discover that Richard's arrest triggered a devastating chain reaction. His accomplices were arrested one by one, his completely dismantled criminal network. The other victim families finally found justice, and several of them had sent letters of thanks to David for having the courage to expose the truth. "And there's one more news," Sarah continued, her eyes shining. "The Carter Delgado Foundation for Vulnerable Families received an anonymous donation of $2 million. Apparently, an international investor was impressed with our cause." David smiled. The foundation had been the idea of Manuel, who suggested transforming traumatic experience into something that could protect other families from predators like Richard. In 6 months, they had already helped 43 families to identify and protect themselves from domestic scammers, creating a verification protocol that was being adopted by domestic employment agencies across the country. The phone rang. It was Marcus Thompson, the researcher who had been critical to exposing Richard. "David, you need to see the news. Richard 10. I'm giving an interview from the prison, claiming to be the victim of a conspiracy against him. It lasted exactly 3 minutes before the other prisoners found that he tortured defenseless women. Let's say it is in permanent isolation for safety itself." David hung up with a strange feeling. He did not enjoy Richard's suffering, but recognized the poetic justice of the situation. The man who had used his charm and intelligence to destroy families now lived completely isolated, with no one to manipulate, without psychological games to play. Manuel appeared at the door carrying an envelope. "Mr. David, a letter arrived for the Lord. It was from Harvard Business School, the True. They had found that Richard used the university name fraudulently and wanted to formally apologize, offering a full scholarship to any postgraduate program that David chose." Irony was delicious. The institution Richard had falsified being in the curriculum now offered his genuine services to the victim. Do you know what is most amazing in all this? Sarah said, looking out the window to Manuel, who worked with 2 new assistants that David had hired. If Richard had not underestimated Manuel, if he had treated him with a minimum of respect, he had never been discovered. David agreed. Richard's class arrogance had been his ruin. He saw Manuel only as the Philippine gardener, and never imagined that he was dealing with a brilliant engineer who would meticulously document each crime. The same arrogance that made him underestimate a qualified immigrant also made him underestimate the determination of a husband who deeply loved his wife. 3 months later, David received a call that made him smile for the first time in a genuinely cheerful way in a long time. It was the director of Europe's largest construction company, offering a partnership that would multiply his business by 5. Mr. Carter, his reputation for integrity has come to us. We want to work only with people who show character in both business and personal life. Revenge against Richard had become something unexpected, international recognition. The way David had dealt with betrayal, using intelligence instead of violence, seeking justice rather than revenge, impressed the business world. Contracts arrived from all continents, all mentioning Carter integrity as a decisive factor. Sarah had also found her way. Using traumatic experience as a motivation, he became a legal defender of victims of domestic psychological abuse. Her first judicial victory was a case where she helped a woman escape a manipulative husband who used Richard's similar tactics. "I know exactly what you're feeling," she had said to the client, "and I know exactly how to get out of it." Manuel had become much more than an employee. It was practically family. David promoted him the director of domestic security, and he was developing an application that would help families to verify domestic employees rapidly and efficiently. "Technology must serve humanity," Manuel always said, "especially those who others think are powerless." On the anniversary of a year from Richard's arrest, David received one last letter from him. It was not of regret or apology, but pure anger and empty threats. "You destroyed my life. One day I will leave here," and the letter ended abruptly, apparently censored by prison employees. David threw the letter in the trash without finishing reading. Richard had not yet learned the more basic lesson. When you declare war against a real love family, you are not just fighting against individuals. You are fighting a force that will move mountains to protect those who love. 6 months later, David was giving a lecture at Harvard Business School on business ethics and confidence management. In the audience, hundreds of future executives listened carefully as he told his story. "The biggest lesson I have learned," concluded, "is that true success is not just what you build, but how you protect what really matters." The applause was deafening. After the lecture, a young student approached. "Mr. Carter, how did you manage not seek violent revenge? How did you keep the class even so betrayed?" David smiled, remembering Manuel's words during the most difficult times. "The best revenge is not to destroy your enemy. It is to build something so beautiful and lasting that it makes its evil completely irrelevant." Today, 3 years later, Richard Wells remains in federal prison, serving a sentence that will keep him away from society until his early 70s. Occasionally tries to give interviews alleging innocence, but no one else believes in the lies of a man who lied his own crimes. David and Sarah Carter built a business empire that employs more than 15,000 people, a foundation that protected hundreds of families, and a stronger relationship than ever. Manuel Delgado became an American citizen, graduated in law, and today directs the legal department of the Carter Delgado Foundation. The real victory was not the arrest of Richard Wells. It was the discovery that when full people come together against wickedness, they not only survive, they thrive in ways their aggressors could never imagine. Richard tried to destroy a family, but ended up strengthening something indestructible: true love protected by intelligence and determination of people who know exactly what is worth fighting. If you have been through betrayal or injustice, remember, the best revenge is not to demean yourself at the level of those who have hurt you. It is to rise so much that their wickedness becomes just a footnote in the history of their success. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that integrity always wins, even when the path seems impossible.